Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup Interviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and this is one I've been excited about for quite a while now. I am joined today by a wonderful guest. Fans of Toronto theatre probably know him well. He is a very prolific actor, director, writer, clown, improviser, all-around very well-rounded performer, and I'm so happy to talk to him today because we recently reviewed his show Crosstown at the Toronto Fringe Festival in part 3 of our Toronto Fringe Roundup, and there's so much I've been wanting to say about that show that we could barely scratch the surface of in our review. So, HRH Anand Rajaram, how are you doing today?
Really good, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay,
Doing really well.
I'm so happy to have you on the show. I've been a fan of your work for quite some time, so it's so nice to sit down across from you. It looks like, for those listening in audio only form, it looks like you're sitting in the middle of some sort of supernova, some kind of exploding star right now in your background. That's neat.
Yeah.
How's that going?
It's good. If you look at if you see the video, the way the stars are moving, the ship is going this way.
Okay.
So you're moving forward, I'm moving backwards.
Right. Boldly going where no podcast has gone before. This is amazing. Yeah. Fantastic. I usually start with our icebreaker question about what you're drinking, but since I just introduced you, I actually want to start with a different icebreaker, and then we'll do the cup in a second. But I introduced you as HRH, the honorific that precedes your name in most of your recent credits and programs and how you're listed on social media. I feel like that's a pretty recent addition. I've been seeing you perform for quite some time. I actually kind of dug up the program for the public reading of an unproduced screenplay about the death of Walt Disney, which was just this past April, and you're still credited without it there. So I feel like this is a pretty recent addition to how you've been crediting yourself in things. Perhaps some of our listeners might be interested where this comes from, what it stands for, and why you've recently committed to adding it to everything?
Yeah, sure. I can't say that I remember the specific day, time, or moment where I thought to change and add HRH, His Royal Highness. I mean, there was a bunch of times when I was younger when I would create pieces and kind of cosplay royalty.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I wrote, there's a bunch of little short bits and things that I did, little captions, where I was playing with an idea. But more recently, I guess I got to thinking, let me say it this way. When you think about royalty, how does someone get an honorific for royalty? So really only two ways to get it, right?
Mm-hmm. Are you asking me what the two are? Because I assume it's you have to be the descendant of someone whose ancestors killed the most people in some medieval war. And that's the only one I could think of.
Or you did the killing.
Ah, yes. If you're on the long enough time scale, yes.
Either you murder somebody and you take over a position and you declare yourself king, or you have an ancestor who did it and you're part of that hereditary lineage. And I guess who is anybody to say that I'm not a part of the lineage? Yeah. People have asked me, people get upset because they go, why are you from royal descent? And I go, I don't know, probably, maybe. Why not? Sure. We're all connected, so probably. And then they get upset because they're like, well, I was going to give you the respect of like maybe your royalty, but now you're just messing around. Why would I? And so then I'm like, well, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
I have parents, I have grandparents, so do other people. You're going to celebrate somebody whose ancestors killed somebody? I mean, live your life, declare what you want. So it was at some point I just thought, it's funny. It's just really funny to me. So I started changing all my social medias. And I don't put it officially in contracts. I don't put it official as a designation. Because because people get upset, people get irritated. And I do a lot of things to irritate people inadvertently anyway. So in the really nice times when it's happened, like there's 3 that I can think of. The first one was I got a program from Luminato in the mail addressed to HRH, which was incredible. Then another one was Murdoch Mysteries recently that I did. I went to the reading of the script before we shot, and my card with my name on it had HRH.
Nice.
And again, it was because I think they didn't want to offend me. They were like, is that his name? I don't know. What is it? I don't know. Put it down. So in order to not offend me, they put it up there. But whether it'll be in the credits a Murdoch this fall or not.
Oh.
And then the other one was when I did Buffoon in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't credited doing the show as HRH, but if you pick up the copy of the book, the script, the published script, it's HRH in there. And they're very nice to accommodate.
Oh, very nice. So this thing that's basically just a joke, you have basically kind of, you've gotten it into the world. It's in circulation. People are legitimately questioning, if they don't want to offend you. Murdoch Mystery is afraid that they're going to squash your royal title. It's great.
It's a joke as much as any royal title is a joke. That's what
well said. You say people get offended by you choosing it for yourself. Is it possible that some of them are offended by the implication that you or your ancestors murdered that many people?
I don't think they think about the murder. I think they think about, who do you think you are?
Right.
Who do you think you are? I heard, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So Žižek had this joke that I really liked. He was like, he said he heard this joke that there was a rabbi walks in the synagogue and he says, "Oh God, like I am not worthy. I'm not worthy. I'm nothing, and I'm here to pay obeisance and worship you." And then with the rabbi is a very wealthy man, and he says, "Me too, God. I am so unworthy. I'm not worthy. I'm the lowest of the low, and I completely humble myself before you." And then beside this very rich man is a very poor man, and the very poor man says, "Me too, God. I am so unworthy. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy." And the rich man turns to the rabbi and says, "Who does he think he is?"
Well, okay, interesting story. Thank you, Žižek, for that. So, okay, that's great. So sorry to kind of derail our introduction with that, but I was very curious about that. And now, because it did really feel like it was really just within the past few months that I started noticing it showing up next to every time I saw your name. So if you were of royal lineage, I would have assumed it would be there since birth, as is your birthright.
Right. Well, in terms of this is another small sidetrack, but my name is Anand Rajaram, but it's actually not Anand Rajaram.
No?
My grandfather's name, he's passed away now, but his name was Vishwanath. And so then grandfather's name gets passed down to grandson. That's the lineage. My grandfather's name is Vishwanath, so my name is Vishwanath. But my grandfather was alive when I was born, and it's considered very bad form to use the name while the other person's alive. So my name was Anand as a substitute while my grandfather was alive. But then, of course, it never changed back to Vishwanath. And on top of that, in the South Indian tradition, men only have one name. So my name, Anand Rajaram. Rajaram is my father's name. My father's name is Parshuram Rajaram, but his father's name was Parshuram. So it would have been something else, Parshuram, which means my name really should be Rajaram Anand or Rajaram Vishnu. This is a whole sidestep you didn't need to know about.
No, I'm happy to hear it. It's good. All names are made up in some way. So if you want to give yourself a title, I think that's well within your right to do that.
Right.
Fantastic. Okay, to return to our usual icebreaker that I'm doing terrible interview skills by not starting with, what's in your cup today?
I just have filtered water today. That's
perfect. Stay hydrated. Nice. I have some cold brew in this nice cup because it is very warm outside.
Oh, very nice.
Yes, fantastic. Okay, so why don't we start? You've already told us quite a bit about yourself, but tell us a little more about yourself and specifically in terms of your career in theater and the performing arts, maybe some backstory. How did you first get into it? Maybe some relevant training, experiences, projects. I like to give the interviewees the floor to describe their identity as a theater person, however they see fit.
Sure. There's always the distinction between the thing you are and the thing that you do. You may be something, but not do the thing that you are. For example, you can't be an engineer without an engineering mindset. You can't be a poet without a poet mindset. You could be a poet engineer. You can even be an engineer poet. The job that you do is different than the job that you are. So I feel like as a performer, I was always a performer. I had an innate interest in performing, but there was no path for me to be a performer when I was younger. My parents didn't really support the idea. They were worried about me struggling because it is a difficult profession. Yeah. So they didn't want me to go into this field, but I had the mindset, and I was lucky that I had the ability and the opportunity and privilege and I guess the boldness to just try to align the feeling of what I was with what I do. Not everybody can. And so as a young, like my mother tells me that I was a storyteller when I was a kid, that I would come home and I would tell a story, but I wouldn't just say the thing. I would do it as a storyteller. So I guess I always had the innate ability, probably from my grandfather, who was also a great storyteller, the same one that I'm the namesake of. So, and I remember also seeing movies, watching Chaplin and other silent movies in India with my family. I remember watching my mother especially laugh at some comedy and enjoying seeing that and thinking, oh, can I make my mother laugh? And my mother was my first audience. So I would try to make her laugh. And then from there, I started to work with like trying to make the class laugh, friends laugh. And so the idea of performing just to make other people feel good came early as a thing. And it was addictive. It's an addictive drug, getting a laugh. But in terms of actual performance, there may have been small things like in grade 4 for French class. I had just started learning French, and for some assignment, I decided to write a play in French about a bumbling waiter who spills soup on everybody in a restaurant, fancy restaurant. So I wrote that play, and then in grade 5 for the speech arts competition, I thought, well, maybe I'll perform a play. So put the thing together. I directed. It was my first show I ever directed, and the actors. We did it, and then we won for the class, and then we went to the school competition, and I think we came in second place. The guy who won was this kid who talked about his life dealing with cerebral palsy. And I'm like, well, all right, if a slapstick comedy about spilling soup had beat that, I would have felt terrible. So it feels like, well, that hit its end. And I was told by a teacher at that point, the show was funny, the show was good, but it's slapstick, it's not serious. You have to do things that are serious. And I thought, well, it's so sad, but okay, I guess they know what they're talking about.
Well, tell that to Chaplin. Well, he took slapstick very seriously.
This is what I think those kinds of formative experiences are why I'm HRH now. Because why not? Because what do you have to be serious for? For what? For what at the end of the day? So anyway, after that, I guess it was just, there was no formal training. I took a couple of classes in drama in high school, and I really connected with it. But again, I had no thought that I would actually go into being a performer. And then in university, I ended up going to Waterloo, and I was going to, I was either doing philosophy or economics. I wasn't quite sure which field I wanted to go into. I started in psychology. Partway through, I felt like I'm doing these studies looking at people through the lens of statistics and batch behavior. And there's always, a series of lenses you can look through, but there's all sorts of things you're not looking at. And so it's never quite complete. So you're constantly chasing, perfecting this model. But if I embodied a manner of thinking of one of those people in the study and tried to understand why they do the thing they do, it's far more interesting. And it is cosplay, because how can I know? I'm not in their life. And yet there is a funny thing that happens when you wear someone else's clothes, when you say someone else's words, when you engage in someone else's relationships, in someone else's context, in someone else's narrative, especially when the narrative is a heightened narrative, not just like wake up and have cereal and go for a walk, but something more compressed, intense, and detailed than that. There's certain foundational things that make you go, well, there's a commonality to the way people probably behave. And you start to understand people differently. And that was really fascinating to me, because as a kid, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a dog when I grew up. And then my parents said, you can't do that. And it depressed me so much. And then I was like, well, can I be anything else but this little kid? Can I be an animal? Can I be a girl? Can I be anything? They're like, no, you could choose a profession, but this is kind of it. And it upset me. And I was like, I want to live 1 million lifetimes. How do I do it? I guess I got to be reincarnated. But maybe I can do it in this life by wearing other people's clothes and saying their lines. Because ultimately what it comes down to is, how do I think differently?
Wow, that's incredible. So, wow, thank you for sharing all that. And I can already tell certain parts of this are going to resonate when we get into Crosstown specifically, because you wear a lot of people's clothes and voices and identities in that piece. Before we get there, see, you've done a good job of taking who you are in your head and turning it into what you do for a living. You've obviously had a very illustrious career on both stage and screen. Would you care to shout out maybe a few favorite or memorable credits that you've had, or ones that really hold a special place in your heart?
I'll tell you, one that's really special is when I was in university. I had a very hard time. I think I didn't really know myself yet. I had just switched over to the drama program without telling my folks. I switched out of psych and I did drama. And I was really lucky. The university, it was Waterloo. And the people in my class, I was so lucky to be amongst them because it was Jonathan Goad, Johnny Goad, from Strat, Kimwin Barahinik, Mark McGrinder, both of whom founded Studio 180 with their first long-time artistic director, Joel Greenberg, who was also our prof in the department. And then Dylan Roberts, who's a very dear friend, who also went on to continues to be an actor. There was a bunch of people in my class who just watching them inspired me so much that was better training than any of the classes that I took. So I started doing those classes, but getting into the shows, we didn't do that many shows. And I never got in. I auditioned, but I just never got in. I think people thought I wasn't serious. So I did maybe 2 or 3 shows, but very small parts. I hardly performed in university. But the KW Little Theatre, there was a director named Linda Carson, who's also a playwright. She's passed away a few years ago. She was holding auditions. I went to read for something called I Hate It, which is about a film and TV actor who just wants to do real art. And he gets a chance to go and do Shakespeare in the Park. And his agent hates it because he's like, what do you, you're sitting there and there's bugs and people eating around you. And which armrest is mine? I hate this. What are you doing this for? You don't want to make any money. Like, this is crazy. Go and do a big movie, be famous, be successful, And so the guy struggles with it, the actor, and he meets the ghost of John Barrymore, who had played Hamlet ages before. And the ghost of John Barrymore kind of guides him through in how to commit to this life and do the thing that is his passion. And I went from feeling like I was marginalized as an outsider, and I don't mean this as any disrespect to my colleagues or my professors or anything in university. I think maybe I didn't feel confident enough in the room, maybe, or maybe they just didn't see me fitting in, because it'd be like, I don't know how you as a South Asian performer in an audience of non-South Asians or non-anything but white, I don't know how you fit into this world without standing out. So we kind of put you in marginal parts here and there so you don't disrupt that narrative. Or maybe I wasn't a strong enough performer. But Linda was like, well, I don't care. Like, you embody the part. Why don't you play the part? And it was the first lead part I ever had. And it transformed me because it gave me confidence in myself because she believed in me. It gave me a long arc to build a character from start to finish, to have a journey, to do physical stunts. There was so much stuff that I got to do doing that. There was no money. It was a short run. It's a community theater project. And yet it was one of the most beautiful and profound moments that I've had in my life study.
Wow.
That was a big one. The soup place, the soup play, grade 4 and 5 was a big one. It's less about the accolades of like the big things that I've done or any awards or how many people have seen it or none of those things all the projects are interesting to me, but the ones that I hold most dear are the ones with the greatest amount of personal growth. And that's 2 of them.
Wow. No, that's just interesting. Have you ever redone the soup one since that grade 5 speech presentation?
I don't even know. I think it needs a revisit. I don't know where it is. I got to go dust off a draft. Find it if I can.
Maybe for Fringe next year, you'll give it a try.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. So, as I've alluded to a few times, we recently reviewed your show Crosstown at this year's 2024 Toronto Fringe Festival in our roundup. I enjoyed the show very much. I had a lot of thoughts about it, and I'd love to get into that with you. And maybe, I've gone on the record even in that review that I wanted to do that. So I'm really happy that we have this opportunity. I'm going to kind of put a blanket statement at the beginning here that I really hope that this show gets remounted somewhere, and maybe it will. Hopefully, I know it's already had a short remount, but hopefully somewhere else on a larger stage for a longer run. So if anybody happens to be watching this in the future in anticipation of seeing a possible remount, we're going to start with a bit of a non-spoiler discussion of generalities about the piece. And then we will put a clear demarcation of when we're getting into spoiler talk. So if anyone is excited to see the show but doesn't want to know too much about the specifics, we will let you know when to stop watching. Does that sound good to you in terms of how we can proceed with this piece? Okay, so let's get into the non-spoiler part of this. Let's just start with what drew you to the project. When did you first read the novel, and what made you decide that you wanted to adapt it into a one-man show?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for all that. Thanks for all the support on this, and I hope it gets some. The history of this project is, and this is something I would say to young performers who are watching this, who are looking for advice. And usually the question is, how do I get an agent? And it's really not the thing you want to be doing first. What you want to do is build your confidence, build your skills, and work with people and build a community. So the way that I did that early on was I thought, okay, there's film programs. York has a program, and TMU has, I think they might have a program. I'm not sure if they do one. I think Sheridan, Sheridan does it. There's a few different places that have programs in the city of Toronto. So they will have auditions because the graduating directors there want to make films. So go and drop off your photo resume and show interest. You may meet somebody. Anybody who's gone to the trouble of getting an education may continue on that trajectory professionally. So you partner with them right away. You build those relationships right away. You'll be at similar places in growth. You know what I mean? So I put my photo up at York University. A guy named Jigar Talati, real sweet guy, good friend now, but I didn't know him, and he auditioned me for a short film that he was doing as his graduate film at York. And the film was great. It's really short, really funny, very charming and cute. And it ended up getting selected at the Toronto Film Festival and got a lot of heat behind it. And so as soon as Jerry graduated and this film did well, he got an agent. And that agency made a habit of kind of buying options for books as soon as they came out, probably before they even read them, just to hold the option in case it was something they wanted. So they'd option Crosstown. They gave Jigger the book and they said, read this, maybe you want to make it. We have the rights to it. Jigger gave it to me, I read it, and this would have been in 97, 98.
Yeah.
So or maybe as late as 2000. Anyway, I read it. I was like, this is really cool. I think I'm too young to play it. But yeah, I would love to work with you. Let's do it. And then things got sidetracked. The project never happened. And I had the book and I forgot about it. And it was just sitting on my shelf. And every now and then, because the story was quite compelling, I would think about it. And then more recently, I was going through my bookshelf and I saw the book and I was like, oh yeah, let me read that. And then when I read it, there it is.
Yeah.
I got in touch with the writer, Richard Scrimger, who happens to be a Toronto writer. He lives in my neighborhood-ish and was very sweet, met me for coffee. And I said, look, I'm thinking of doing this thing. I did Buffoon, which is a one-person show. Similarly, I'd like to adapt. This is a one-person show. It's a Fringe thing. There's no money. There's no budget yet or whatever. But I don't know what the process for auctions is. Tell me what I can do to get that. And he was like, it's okay. Go ahead. Just take it.
Wow.
He was like, my only limitation is I have somebody who's optioned it like multiple times over the years. People have optioned it to make a movie. Nobody could figure out how to make it work, so it never went. And that's true even now. There's a filmmaker who's in LA who's trying to make it. He wrote a whole script, but he wasn't able to find a through line that worked for him. So he kind of put it on the back burner. Richard called the filmmaker and said, this guy wants to do it. I said, okay, if he does this small Fringe thing. And the guy was like, yeah, it'd actually be great to get a different set of perspective on it, different eyes on it. So, yeah, Richard was really sweet, gave me the rights for free, and said, if it develops down the road, let's talk about it. So the whole journey of getting there was like, because of putting up my picture at York University.
Wow. So serendipitous. Do you know if that filmmaker happened to come to Toronto to see the performance or not?
He was here, but he wasn't able to, he was shooting something he wasn't able to work. But then, he asked if he could see the script. And I had a video archive of it. And it's video archive of theater, but it seems to work. So I sent him that. I sent him the script. I haven't heard back. I think he's just reviewing it now. And then we're going to discuss, he took a completely different tack to what I took. wildly different. So I think he was really interested in seeing, is this another better through line? It is very cinematic as a script. It's cinematic as a book. And even performatively, I think it lends itself to something cinematic very easily. So there's a few friends of mine who are filmmakers who saw it and immediately, why don't we make this into a movie if it's not somebody else's rights? So let's see.
Yeah, well, hopefully if that movie does happen, you will be cast in it, because I think you're perfect for not just the role, but all the roles, as you've just demonstrated. So I showed the book on the screen here. I'm not going to lie, this is a hard book to find. It is currently unavailable on Amazon.ca. If anybody even wanted to give Bezos their money for it, they couldn't. Chapters in Indigo doesn't even have it listed, period. The Toronto Public Library only has one copy, but it's at the reference branch, so you have to sit there to read it. I am fortunately a graduate student at U of T, and they had this one copy in their library that I grabbed so I could read it before seeing the show. But I bring all this up to say, it's kind of an old book now. It's from 1996. It was published. I don't imagine most of the people who saw your performance, like me, got a chance to read it before, or have likely read it anytime recently. So how did you navigate that in your adaptation process, considering the fact that there's sort of no burden of familiarity that people have in it, but you also need to make sure in your experimental approach that it would be comprehensible and that the audience who knows nothing about it would be able to follow the very fascinating, somewhat tangled narrative that it weaves?
It's
Thoughts?
it's actually a great benefit that people haven't read. Because if they read it and they knew it well and they love this book and it's their whole thing, then when they come to see a movie or a play, they'll be like, but you missed this, and that was my favorite part. Why'd you cut that line? They have all of those kind of ideas about it that they already bring. This one, they're seeing it brand new. And then it's a rare circumstance where you see something and then you go visit the source material, where usually people know Pride and Prejudice then, basically. So I don't know how many people have read this book, but I think it did circulate. There's a friend of mine on Facebook, Alan Stratton, who knows Richard. And I don't know Alan that well. We're Facebook friends. I don't think we've ever met in person. And when I posted this, he knew right away. And he was like, that's great book. I'm glad you're doing it. Which is kind of interesting. Why I assume nobody would know about it. So it's actually very, very liberating to be able to find your own way through the narrative and find what makes sense to you. And also Richard gave me like carte blanche to do what I wanted with it. So there's lots that I wrote. The book itself has a lot of dialogue, but not enough to pull out and make a play. And even the dialogue that is in there sometimes needs some rewording because of what it's referencing or for a variety of reasons. So there's a lot to which I was rewriting the story and curating it to that lens that I was using on the film. So all in all, it's actually really liberating. If you can find works like that that are out of print, that are hard to get, it's a good one to adapt because then you are able to do what you want.
Yeah, no, it's very fascinating. And you mentioned how some people, if it's a familiar book, they have their expectations and they berate you for changing or not including things. How did Richard Scrimger feel about it? I assume he saw the performance if he's in your neighborhood.
He did. He's seen it 3 times. He saw it twice at the Fringe. And then when I remounted it at the VideoCabaret space, I was supported by the Boulevard Teatro, which is Daniele Bartolini's company. DLT Experience, great company. He saw the show, he loved it, and he said if you need any help with it at all, and I was like, well, VideoCabaret's offered their space to do a remount for just a handful of shows, and he's like, let me help you. I'll help set up the box office and the website. So he did all of the things all the producing side for free, really.
So
just
nice of him. Yeah.
It was really beautiful.
He had a wonderful show in the Fringe as well, the You Hamlet. So he had the time to even take this on in addition to that. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Richard saw it 3 times. He said between the first 2 times and when I remounted it, I did some rewriting. I cut, I changed, I wrote new parts. And he did come and he was like, you lost that one line. And I'm like, what one line? He was like, you say this line about his lungs are like shriveled up little bags. And I was like, oh yeah. And he goes, yeah, I really like that line. I mean, you do what you want, but I really like that line.
So wait, he wasn't commenting that you changed things from his book. He was commenting that you dropped one of the lines that you had kept in the script because he was so familiar with the ins and outs of your adaptation and performance by this point.
Yeah. I mean, he's an artist too, right? And he crafted the words, and he wants to tell the story based on what he crafted. So when I go change it, he kind of feels like, what are you doing? That's my poetry. That's my artistry. But he was very, very good natured about it. He wasn't upset. He was like, you do whatever you want. I just thought I should tell you, I love that line, but that's okay. Do what you want. But he's super supportive. Even now, like I'm talking about, maybe I'd like to see if I can get it to tour or do something else. He's still super, super easygoing. The remount at VideoCabaret, it was the same. He didn't charge me anything. He said, go ahead and do it. If at some point you get like a nice big payroll for it, let's work it out. But otherwise, it's all good.
Oh, it's very genial of him. It's funny, like I wasn't familiar with this book. I made a point of getting it out in anticipation of seeing your show, but I thought the name Richard Scrimger sounded familiar. And then I remembered that I'd read a series of children's books that he wrote when I was a kid. The Norbert trilogy, I think it was. The Nose from Jupiter was the book. And that was like such a weird throwback. And this is we will call it a very adult book. So knowing that this is someone who mostly writes children's works, having that, it was like, I'm trying to even remember what happened in it. It was like the Great Gazoo from Flintstones meets Cyrano de Bergerac, if I kind of recall correctly, like an alien helping like a kid with his crush. Or I'm struggling to remember. Apologies, Richard Scrimger, if you're watching this, but I remember enjoying it as a kid. But yeah, it's fascinating that, and once we get post spoiler, I have more thoughts about the book itself. But I want to kind of get into next. How did you approach the process of writing the adaptation? You sort of alluded to some things about like removing and adding dialogue, but was there anything else? Was there sort of a through line to the process? How you really tackled it?
Yeah, there's a few things that I had to set as rules for myself right away. The first rule was I didn't want to do third person narration. And so everything had to be first person. But in doing first person, I didn't want it to be first person describing the thing that I'm doing. I'm walking down the street. I find a can of soda. I pick it up, but it's empty. Oh, there's bees in it. I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to say, can I make everything a living thought? So I'm not kind of commenting on myself as I go. So that was the second. The third rule was I started with looking at the simplest through line through, and then thinking like, okay, if I just get a simple through line, straight through line, then I could put a bunch of stuff that I cut back in. And what I discovered is the simple through line was the exact length that it needed to be. So there was all sorts of tangents that I thought, if it's not helping the thesis of what this story is, then it just has to go. So it was hard initially because I respect Richard, I respect the book, and try to be supportive of his work too. And there's so many great characters and so many great kind of situations and weird, funny scenarios that are in it. But ultimately, it was just one of those things. I was like, well, this project is not the book. The book already exists. This project has to be its own thing. So I have to make hard choices. And that meant cutting. After all that was cut, then I was like, okay, so in the through line that I have, do I have enough dialogue? Do I have to write more scenes of dialogue? Sometimes there'd be a short statement that I would expand into a dialogue, and vice versa, some longer scene that I might truncate into a very short, simple exchange. So it was a slow process initially, and then super fast by the end once I kind of figured out what I was doing.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's again, so many more thoughts that I should save for post spoiler because of a lot of the ways you handle that might kind of reveal some things. But writing it is one thing. And then there's the performing it, which you've opted to do this as a solo performance, which requires you to do all of these very different characters' voices. And it's so impressive the way that you are able to flip back and forth between them. I don't want to sound like everybody's uncle telling their actor, niece or nephew, gee, how do you memorize all those lines? But like the way you do this performance is truly remarkable. And, we've seen and reviewed you in It's a Wonderful Life, the live radio play at YPT. So yeah, Buffon, of course, like we've seen you do this type of performance before, but like this, I think this is like a next level of you handling this entire performance this way. I don't know, just how did you decide what the various characters' voices would sound like? Did you have a favorite character to voice? Anything else you want to comment on this process of constructing the actual performance architecture of it would be really fascinating.
Yeah, so I'll say something first about the fact that you saw. I appreciate that you saw YPT when we did "It's a Wonderful Life," which it's a radio play based on the script of the movie. So in the radio play, we do the sound foley and we're reading the script and performing, but we're only kind of pretending to read the script. The script is there as a reference point, but we're really just performing it. So we do changing voices, and the audience watch us playing all these different characters, changing voices, and the process of doing that. It's not like I didn't know, but having an audience watch you do that, you think, oh, are they going to be like, it's hard to connect because you keep changing your voice and your face. But very quickly, you understand that if you give them a context, suspension of disbelief, they go, oh, okay, you're this guy now. Oh, you're that now. So this is part of my VideoCabaret experience. In VideoCabaret, I would play, all of us would play like 18 or 20 or more characters. So you differentiate characters because we're all in white face makeup. We differentiate our characters by changing the facial expression, changing posture, and then changing our voice. And then we could rapidly go from one character to another. VideoCab taught me that first thing of having a hook of a word, a phrase, an expression, a physical something that allows you to immediately jump into a character, which not only helps you, but helps the audience when they see it to go, oh, I know who you are because I see it right away. I remember you're that guy. VideoCab is helped by costume, by headpieces, like incredible wigs. This one, like the YPT show, the radio play, didn't have any change of costume. It was just change of voice. And then when I did the Disney play, the Death of Walt Disney, that one is also a script-based play where we're supposed to treat it like a reading. And in fact, Lucas Nath, the playwright, had told Mitchell Cushman, don't do anything. Just have the actors sit around and just read the script. And Mitchell was like, well, I want to do something more dynamic, and came up with a really imaginative, beautiful, incredible idea of doing it in brown with a rotating stage. And the script slowly becomes part of the chaos and part of the storytelling, a really essential part of the storytelling. But again, the audience sees the premise with the scripts. They see that there are characters reading, and at some point they forget. They see the script, but as it transforms and as the characters transform, they completely let their imagination buy into the story. Additionally, Second City, or when I did mine on my own and with Corpus Dance Theater, every time you suggest something to the audience, suspension of disbelief, they accept it. Okay, in Second City, you're going to come out and pretend you're a horse. They go, okay, you're a horse now. You don't have to do much. Just do enough for me to think, oh yeah, that's a horse. Now do horse-like things. Okay. Same with the mime. It's corporal movement. So I did Cowboys and Indians was a mime show. That was I did at some works, and I did a long remount that was about 75 minutes long, solo show. All mime, storytelling like watching a silent film. So all of those experiences culminated in this process where I was like, okay, I'm now doing this as a reading, actual reading. I sit in the music stand and I read the script. And one of the reasons for that is the edit of the script happened like up to the 11th hour before I did my first show at Fringe. So when I read it out loud, I read it a couple times to myself, but I really just performed it for the first time in front of the audience and heard it and received it back from them. So in reading the script, they could see I've got a script and I'm reading it. Can I still, in spite of no costume, no props, not even that much physicality, very small gesture, but just voice alone and context, can I transport the audience? And it was an experiment. If you remember when you asked me about coming to review the show, I was very excited for you to do it. But I did say I wanted to talk to you about the experiment because I don't know if it would work. I didn't know that I wouldn't do it, and people would be like, well, what the hell is this? I could have gone and watched like a great clown show or something. I'm watching a guy reading a script. What the hell is this? I didn't know. But I took a chance, and when I read it, it was the same basic ideas that I used in all those other experiences, where you choose a character and you just drop in, and then the audience can drop in with you. And a lot of those choices of which character was not something that I did deep character bio or deep research or experimented and tried a bunch of voices. It was just, I closed my eyes and thought, what does this guy look like? And then a voice would come to me and then I'd speak.
Wow. And you do such a good job of like coming up with voices where everyone is so different that the second you switch into one of them, the audience can instantly tell who it is. And maybe some of that is the voice, some of it's the posture and just the attitude and the way you're performing it. But like I talked, like, because I had read the book and read it so recently, I felt like I had this like, Matrix vision of I can see this in a way that maybe not everyone can. So I kept asking people after I saw it, like, yeah, how did you find it? Were you ever confused? And like almost everyone I spoke to said, no, I was able to follow along perfectly because the way that you switch between the voices, every character was so clearly defined and differentiated that there was never confusion or a problem. So just hats off to you for really just, yeah, it's so remarkable. We got to get you in a production of the Lehman trilogy at some point because I feel like that would suit your skill set very well. So, okay, I'm itching to get to the spoiler section here. Let's say hypothetically somebody were to remount this at some point and somebody is watching this right now on the fence about whether or not to see it. What's the pitch you would give them to try to convince them?
I don't know about convincing them, but they ask what it's about. It's parallel narratives. We follow the story of an unhoused man walking the streets of Toronto, getting across town from the mission that he was at, which is now being demolished, to another mission on the other end of town. And so there's his process doing that, his journey. And then the parallel narrative is a doctor who is a young doctor working his way up through the hierarchy in the hospital. And these two stories then intersect. And you learn about that later on, and how they intersect is kind of the interesting part of the story.
Okay, so if that sounds interesting, and it is, I will tell you, it is very interesting and very well done. Check this out wherever it's playing, hopefully somewhere by the time people might be watching this. And if any artistic directors are watching this, snap this show up because I think it's incredible. It was one of the top shows I saw at Fringe this year. So stunning. And yeah, we need to see more of it. So without further ado, I think I'm excited to let's talk spoilers, really get into some of the weeds here. So if anybody doesn't want to have this spoiled, we're going to put an icon on the screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, maybe a leopard named Poopsie with a speech bubble that says spoilers, because I think that just feels appropriate. If anyone is listening to this and has no idea what I'm talking about, just know we're spoilers from here on out. Okay, so there's so much we could get into. I want to start with something that you mentioned because it was one of your cardinal rules for adapting it, and that's the no third person narration. And it's not even just that there's no third person narration. The novel itself has a very forceful first person narration voice too. And so, yeah, you came to the decision that you didn't want to have that. It was a very, I guess, show don't tell mentality. But then I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this, but there's a lot that, okay, I see you're smiling. Are you finishing my thought for me, or do you want me to try to?
No, I'm excited by you grappling with how to phrase it. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. I'll double back to something else. I think I said something to this effect in the review, but reading the book, I describe it, and I don't think I'm clever for noticing this, but it has a structure that's reminiscent of Homer's Odyssey. I feel like that's very deliberate in it. In fact, like, it's a character making a journey, trying to get home, whatever that kind of means to him. And he meets all sorts of wacky characters along the way. Part of me while I was reading it was trying to see in my head, are there one-to-one connections, kind of like James Joyce's Ulysses, where, oh, this character is the Lotus Eaters and there's the Cyclops, but that was a bit of a fool's errand. And maybe someone smarter than me can figure out if there is something I'm missing there. But also, speaking of Ulysses, I read so much of this while writing the TTC, because it's set in Toronto and traveling from one end of Toronto to the other. So when they're calling out the names of stops that I'm seeing on the page in front of me here, it felt like I was on a Bloomsday pilgrimage in some way, that like it really had that feeling. So I guess why I'm bringing all this up is not only did you cut out, I guess, that sort of epic narration or that sort of epic voice of it, which is similar to what I guess the Greek tragedians did with the Homeric epics, is they isolated one section that they could do some sort of dialogue structure with. But you also, I think you took out, the book I would describe as maybe 60-40 in terms of like the present day homeless journey and maybe 40% of the backstory that ultimately led us there. I think you, very interestingly to my view, located the beating heart more so in that latter portion about the backstory. And I think the majority of the big structural cuts you made are with that sort of the present day homelessness journey. So many of the characters and side little journeys that we meet are completely absent here. Do you want to comment on maybe some of that structure? And sorry, I'm so rambly, but the thoughts are firing.
It's a great question. I suddenly see that if I don't plug my computer, it's gonna.
Okay.
And I put the charger. The essence of your question, can you say it again? Because there was a few thoughts in there.
Okay, I guess just to try to find some sort of kernel of the very stringy question. I guess, how did you at first just locate the beating heart of the story more so in the backstory than the actual journey across town?
Right. Great. So what you discover in the course of the book and in the course of the play is that these parallel storylines happen not at the same timeline. One is the past and one is the future or the present.
Mm-hmm.
My focus was exactly your experience of being on the TTC, looking out and seeing the streets. In a way, what you're seeing when you read a book or you read, say, a tourist brochure that talks about what something was,
mm-hmm.
maybe even has photos of it, and you look at it now, you kind of see that hauntological kind of taking the past and superimposing it on top of the present and seeing ghosts of a different experience, a different time, walking through that space. And the experience of doing that when you're riding the TTC and you're seeing these different names and reference places is you start to think, at least for me, you start to look at people differently. You start to think, I'm usually on my phone or I'm sleeping or I'm listening to something, not really paying attention. All of a sudden, this is forcing me to look at the world and to see people and start to wonder, like, where do they come from? How did they end up here? What is this? When did they buy those shoes? What was the experience of getting that shirt? Was that a gift or was that a choice, that they made on their own? And starting to unpack other people's perspectives, that creates a very empathic kind of connection. So when I did the transfer of the story I focused on the journey of the doctor, and it becomes the story of how the doctor becomes the unhoused guy. You find that's how the stories are linked. You see him unhoused and you think, who is this guy? You see the doctor story, and then sometime you go, oh, so that guy becomes this guy. Now, how does that happen? So once the two ends happen, and you consciously or subconsciously recognize that you have preconceived ideas about what the doctor is and what the unhoused guy is, what the ethos of each one is, what the responsibility of each one is, or what the failings of each one is, for example, to be in the current situation, their ambitions or whatever else. Once you realize they're the same, you think, well, what the hell happened in between? And that's where the whole story kind of opens up and starts to link the narratives together. I think I went way off track from what you asked me. But the process of curating this was centering on the thesis of Richard's book, his thesis is different than my thesis when I was approaching this. His thesis is not really about the unhoused guy. It is, but it's kind of a broader landscape. I see in the way that you talk about the Odyssey. The thing about the Odyssey that's interesting is it's the perspective of the character going through a series of adventures, traveling. This one is that, but this character is way more passive in the book. The character is receiving all of these things. And so it becomes more the character is the city. And he is merely the observer to all the events in the city. It would be like the perspective of the boat,
right.
Not the people driving the boat. And so that's kind of interesting. The book really centers on the city as a character, the city as a place and as a being, and having a life of its own that contains all of these different personalities that all exist. And it doesn't have an absolute about what's right and what's wrong, what's deserved or not deserved. It sits in a I won't say moral ambiguity, but it sits kind of like on the fence about making a strong moral statement about anything, because it kind of says, well, on the one hand, I mean, is there a right and a wrong to anything? This guy who's on the street, is it wrong that he's on the street? Absolutely. But if you watch his story in the book, he still lives an incredibly interesting life. And you go, well, okay, I mean, maybe it sucks for a variety of reasons. I'm sure it sucks for a variety of reasons, but he's still experiencing life. I have this job and I have this, but I'm not experiencing that. So if I say mine is better, well, why is it better? Everybody's experience subjectively is fascinating. And so the city gives the framework to be able to explore our own resonant response to the city as a living being. I think I'm going way off tangent.
No, this is all great.
But did I answer your question?
More or less. I guess, okay, like maybe I'll pivot to a bit because I noticed something interesting and I forget, and I tried to find it again this morning and it doesn't exist on the Fringe website anymore, but the like little blurb that you had on there about what the show is about, which was very deliberately crafted to not spoil anything. I forget how you phrased it, but it was something about like a documentation of urban poverty and class difference. And while certainly a lot of that does exist, I think in your adaptation, I would say that's a lot more prominent in the book itself because of how much of that, the unhoused journey and viewing the city, like you said. Yeah, so it's interesting that I just felt like the blurb that you provided felt closer to the parts you removed from the book in creating your adaptation than as a description of the play itself. Now, class, I think, is more so than poverty itself. Class is still very much a through line, especially with Lucy's parents and the entire dynamic there and the hierarchy of the hospital. But I want how the theme of class and poverty, is that something you'd maybe like to speak on and how it manifested in your work?
Yeah, I think probably the best way to parse it is instead of speaking specifically about class and poverty in general, in the city, in the world, it's everything has to do with ideas, preconceived ideas. Before there was free healthcare in Canada, somebody had to have the idea that that's an interesting idea. And people who said that's outrageous, it could never work, and then figuring out a way. Once there's a will, we make it happen. When COVID happened, all of a sudden we had universal basic income, and it was doable and it was possible. And the ramifications, they can argue economics can say it was a bad idea or good idea, but they could execute if they needed to execute an idea. Poverty is something that we could eradicate if you execute the idea, but you have to first start from a philosophical basis of, do you need to execute it? Like illumination? Are you going to argue that, well, okay, there's somebody who's living on $10,000 a year and $100,000 a year. There's a class disparity. Okay, let's bump the 10,000 and make them live $50,000 a year. Okay, but is there still a disparity between the person who's living on $500,000 a year? Of course. So are you going to say, well, poverty is always going to be there because there's always going to be somebody less off than somebody else? So the thing that I'm trying to explore with the way that I approached it in class, but first of all, I should say that blurb was written before I did the adaptation.
Right.
The blurb was written for early on in the Fringe. But when I was examining the class struggle and the poverty and everything else in it, the first thing I started with is where's the audience coming from with any of it? The movies they've seen, the books they've read, the life they've lived, the streets they've walked, the people they've met, all of that kind of thing. So even in choosing the voices, the gestures, the stuff that I'm saying or not saying, the oblique ways or deliberate ways that I say things, what I'm counting on is an audience who already have a deep understanding without realizing that they do. So I don't have to say this guy is super wealthy or this person's not. Lucy's parents, you know that they're wealthy, but they don't have to say it. You could just tell by the way they carry themselves.
Yeah. Galen's a close friend, as you said, which that line's not in the book. That was fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you remember that. Yeah, 100%. It's that kind of thing of like, there's classes of people that associate with the other classes of people. There's this kind of delineation of these strata. We all acknowledge it. We all know it's true. We let them continue. I declare myself HRH and people get upset. Like, well, who are you to do that? What? You can't just jump status. You can't suddenly jump class. How dare you? You have to stay with your people. And that's funny to me because it's all constructs, you know?
Yeah.
So all this to say, there's the whole conversation about my own views about class status, poverty, abortion, obviously. And
we'll get to that.
Yeah. All of those things that are embedded in the novel. But more interesting than my idea is just a curation, really, of the audience's own sensibilities around all of it by using oblique references where they immediately, I say a church, they know the church that they're imagining. They can see it. They can see the stained glass. I don't have to paint it. I don't have to describe it. And because of those kind of iconic reference points, which is what language does, a lot, I would say 90% of the job is done by the audience in their head. I do small references to things. They have the experience that lives in their head. And then it's up to them to process what do they make of the deconstruction that they witnessed and the recognition of these class distinctions or other distinctions that they've been experiencing as a process, with these worlds colliding.
Right. Okay, interesting. You just, because you mentioned stained glass a moment ago, that actually reminded me of, I love the poster image that you have. Did you design that yourself, or did you hire someone to create that stained glass mosaic type image?
I had an idea for doing a stained glass image, and then I was like, I don't know, it's Fringe, and I don't know. I didn't have a budget, and I don't know artists who I could call just as a favor. I wouldn't ask it. I'd want to pay them. So I was like, okay, let me see if I can at least get a mock-up of what I'm looking for someone to have a reference point for them to build from. Mm-hmm. And I went online and I was like, is there a stained glass filter? There was. Put the photo through and came out. And I was like, well, this, I guess.
Okay. And part of why I bring it up is because, I mentioned the Odyssey comparisons. There is a fairly famous mosaic image of Odysseus from I want to say the 400s AD that looks very similar to that image. I don't know if you've seen
really?
it. I wanted to ask you if that was a deliberate aping. I this looks kind of familiar. I feel like I've seen something like this before, and maybe there's a bias here because I already have these ideas in my head, but I thought that was actually something where you were mimicking the image. So yeah. Couldn't resist asking you about that.
It's really wild. Well, even the book is called Crosstown, but it's Crosstown because he's going across town. There's really very, very little that's biblical or religious in the book. There's little references, but I don't think Richard was trying to write a book. I don't think he's called it Crosstown to make a pun on cross town.
Right.
But I was like, well, let's lean into it. Let's lean into the ethics of what we're talking about. And so from breaking the book out across town, the stained glass image became a real easy one. And then the idea of people being fragmented human beings and shattered, but then you see the picture when it comes back together, was a really beautiful poetic image for me. So yeah, it was one of those impulse things that just kind of
it works. Yeah. Neat. Speaking of some things you cut, I mentioned that I was surprised that the guy who wrote the kids' books I remember reading wrote this, because there's quite a few graphic sexual episodes in the book, including one that is, content warning for anyone who will be troubled to hear about this, but there is a male-on-male graphic rape chapter in the book as well, which is completely absent from, I think I counted 3 very sexual episodes in the book, all 3 of which are absent from your adaptation, including one that is a very tender conversation between Mitch and Lucy that I say it's very tender in your adaptation, but in the book, when she's confiding in him that she had an abortion as a teenager, that all happens in the middle of a sex scene. In the book. Was that a deliberate, we don't need all of this sex and gratuity in here?
Yeah, I think some things, for me, the novel can sit in its own way in kind of how it depicts that. Me to iterate it in a performative sense becomes really weird for people be having sex and talking about abortion becomes one of those what an interesting idea. Doesn't, in the way that I'm trying to do the story, which is a little bit more grounded in reality, grounded in actual reality, it just doesn't ring true. It becomes an interesting literary idea, but not necessarily working for the performative. There are all those things with sex and that brutal rape scene, which, again, I think for my thesis, for what I'm examining, I don't know what it's trying to say. I don't know what it's trying to do. You can parse it through the Odyssey. You can parse it through the city itself as a creature or character and what it does to people and dehumanizes them. You can go that route, but I didn't tell that story. I wasn't going in that story. So it felt like it was gratuitous. It wasn't supporting the prime narrative that I was trying to go through.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, and I specifically draw attention to that scene between Mitch and Lucy talking about that, because reading the novel, I was like, this is interesting but strange the way that conversation was being structured and filtered through that experience. But then watching your version, where it's again just you sitting on your stool, flipping back and forth between these voices, and no sexual contact happening, but I felt so much more watching your version than that kind of jarring or perhaps alienating experience of reading in the book, which was perhaps more fascinating. But I feel like you found the tenderness that conversation not just had, but demanded, in the way that you just had that conversation with yourself in a very, quietly beautiful way. So,
it's kind of interesting to me that, having read the book, and the book is very, very different than live, all the thoughts that you would have had coming in for what you dreaded or what you expected or, what you were excited about, and then what was delivered being so wildly dissimilar or similar in so many ways to whatever you thought. It's interesting to me that you had that preconceived kind of matrix, as you say, to come and see the show from.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also interesting because, as you said, when we were first started corresponding, you told me that you were, you wanted to talk about it because you weren't sure this was a bit of an experiment, and that it was that conversation that is what convinced me to go find the book and read it, because I was very curious. I want to know, before we have this conversation, where it's coming from in order to become what it is, the basis of your experimentation. And reading the book, because it is, solo performances tend to have a very, prominent first person narration to them. So reading the book, I was like, yeah, because it's told in the first person in a lot of ways, I imagine I could envision how it could easily be a standard solo performance. Just, one man standing at a microphone or on stage, narrating it, cut it down to an hour and a half, bada boom, bada bing, pick your favorite episodes, and you have a solo show. But remembering that you emphasize the degree of experimentation, I figured it couldn't just be that, which made me imagine all kinds of wild possibilities about what it might be. And it didn't disappoint.
Oh, that's good. Well, I'll say, too, the experimentation that I was pointing to was not just the edit or the approach, like in terms of the script. It's also the fact that I was doing it as a reading. And doing it as a reading initially was because, like I say, the script was just finalized or the first edit before I edited throughout the Fringe and then again after. Okay. But I didn't have time to memorize the whole thing. But also, what I discovered in doing it is that if there was no music stand, if it was like Buffoon, if it was me playing all the different characters, in Buffoon, you know that you're following Felix the whole way through. And Felix is telling the story, and Felix is embodying the characters. You may forget that it's Felix, but from the inside, it's always Felix telling the story. This one, you end up asking the question, who's talking? Who's talking right now? Is it Mitchell the whole time talking and telling the story? Which I guess it is, because it's his perspective. He's in the whole thing. But there's also an extent to which, if it's Mitchell doing it, then do I have a different relationship when he's talking about, through his lens, his wife, and his wife is talking? Is there, it just starts to get muddy, and it starts to get problematic to try to be Magda, to be the teenager who is going through the procedure. Representing her felt exploitative. So having the music stands was a way to, first of all, do it as more of an audiobook reading. And usually when I listen to audiobooks, I'm doing something. I'm walking around or I'm tidying. I'm not just sitting somewhere listening.
Right. But you could read a book in your hand if you wanted to do that. Yeah.
That's right. But since it's an audiobook, this is demanding people sit, engage collectively together, as opposed to a book which is private. So it's a collective book experience, collective storytelling experience. And the music stand gives me a little bit of a buffer. So the audience can watch me, but I think it invites people much more to say, let me just shut my eyes maybe and just listen and experience this. Let me activate my imagination instead of anything that I do, putting projections up, pictures or gestures that make you have to watch me. I don't want the text to support the performance. I want the performance to support the text. And that's a real foundational idea behind this, different than other work. And that's kind of the experimentation that I was talking about.
Yeah, no, and I think that definitely shines through. It's also interesting with the way you kind of talk about that degree of quotationality. Like, is this Mitchell narrating the memories of these conversations, or are they being just dramatized as they actually happen? And what it's also interesting with the book is that whenever anybody but Mitchell speaks, it's in quotation marks, but when he speaks, it's not. And I actually vaguely remember, I could be wrong about this because it's been decades, but that children's book series that I remember reading by the same author, I think did that too. And I remember as a kid being fascinated by that because I'd never seen a book do that before. And yeah, so I think that really does point to the fact that he is quoting other people in his narration and he doesn't quote himself the same way. And I think in your approach, like I alluded to this a little while ago, that it is very much that you have the epic, Homeric narration that the ancient Greek playwrights would be like, okay, I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's too big. I'm going to select an episode and I'm going to find the units of it that can be communicated through dialogue rather than through this epic voice. And I don't think I have a question about this, but it is just, these are, anything you'd like to comment on that?
Well, yeah, what you reminded me of is that the book is written, and it's really interesting that it's written that way, with no quotations from Mitchell, but all the quotations from others. And even from Mitchell, there's no quotations that differentiate between inside voice that he's thinking and outside voice that he's speaking.
Right.
So you have to make a decision. What you do is you read it and go, that's probably to somebody because they respond, or it's probably to himself because nobody does, or it'd be a weird thing to say out loud. But there's an ambiguity about that, which works for his state of being, that he's kind of like in and not in the world at the same time. So when I was initially adapting it, one of the thoughts too was, should I make a differentiation between inside voice and outside? Should I have a snap light that comes up when he's talking to himself, and then another snap when he's engaged back in the world? And for simplicity's sake, I was like, well, I don't think I want to have a tech heavy show with lights going off and pulling focus. Let me just see if I can keep it simple. In which case, there's no inside voice. It's all outside voice. It just keeps the whole thing super streamlined.
Yeah. And it works really well. Like this, when we feel like something is very like a novel that is appropriate for dramatization, this is usually what we're talking about, that it is, the dialogue itself can carry the story, which might feel interesting to anyone who's read this book, because there is a lot of charm to that inner voice and the first person narration that, to think that it would all be removed, you'd feel like something very significant would be lost. But I don't feel like it was watching your performance, even though so little, if any of that, I think made it into your script. And on the subject of narration, there's an interesting chapter near the end of the book that switches from first person narration into one single chapter of third person narration. It's this kind of narratological trompe d'oeil that it's playing here, in terms of, it's sort of part of we're post spoiler. I think we can talk about, I guess, the twist ending here because I think maybe now is the time to get into the elephant in the womb, if you will, because it's that in poor taste, that pun. I don't know. But the big, I guess, content warning, again, we've alluded to this a few times, but we're going to be talking about abortion as it concerns, the politics of the novel and to a certain extent your adaptation as well. I want to talk about this because this is the thing that, as much as I enjoyed the novel, this was something that threw me for a bit of a loop when I got to the end of it. And I have thoughts about how you handled it in your adaptation, but I feel like, whether it's intending to or not, the novel puts forward what we would call a pro-life or anti-abortion message, or at least engages in some kind of pro-life rhetoric. I don't know anything about Richard Scrimger personally. You've obviously had many more encounters with him than I would, and I don't want to make a moral judgment towards him specifically, but the piece of art he put out into the world, I would say, makes that kind of argument, or engages in that sort of moral logic that feels like it is condemning the cosmic ramifications of participating in administering abortions. Before we get into how you handle this alternatively, do you have any thoughts or comments on that? Because it is pretty prominent.
Yeah, for sure. That was a big concern for me right away when I read the book and looked into adapting it. And I spoke to a bunch of friends about it. And even when I got into Fringe, I was like, should I do this or not? Because there were things that I found really charming and beautiful about the book, book, but that central question is so important in the book that you can't not talk about it. And you can't cut around it. It's like, it's too valid to the whole narrative. So I did at one point ask Richard about it, about what is his thoughts. And Richard was like, I'm absolutely in support of women. I'm absolutely supportive of, abortion rights and women's rights, right to their own body, right to choose. At the same time, it's not like I don't understand why people would be upset and their idea about what, abortion means. So he said, I'm not trying to make a statement in the book, pro or against. I'm trying to just show a thing that exists. But having said that, because of how that's linked to the narrative, that central kind of like reveal that ties the worlds together, you do I think you have to have a perspective on it because of the implications in the real world right now, a lived experience for women, for, the politic of everything that's going down right now. So for me, it was very, very important that I have no ambiguity. It was really important that I state very, very clearly that the play is not trying to say one thing, it's trying to say the other. It's absolutely trying to say it's a woman's right to choose, right to their body. Men don't really have a place in that. But I still had to reconcile this idea. So this spoiler, I could say what happened.
Yeah, please do, for anyone who's watching this who didn't attend the show and doesn't care if things are spoiled.
So the story that we follow in my adaptation, in the book as well, but in my adaptation, is this doctor who's climbing the ranks, comes from an impoverished background and worked hard in school to become a doctor, but has always kind of grew up in poverty and struggled with poverty. So now he's really trying to make his way, make his mark. He meets Lucy, who was born into wealth and kind of doesn't know what to do with her time and her life because she has everything available, but doesn't know how to focus on anything that she has a passion about. So she doesn't have the same kind of crisis that he has of existence. And so he, in the hospital, is doing everything he can to build himself up in the ranks and meets a guy named Leon Opara, who is a very wealthy socialite. And he sits on all the boards of the hospitals. His daughter, Magda, is 15 and is pregnant. And he doesn't, he wants her to. It's not clear in the book whether he impregnated his daughter.
There's just enough implication.
Yeah. It's sitting in a weird place that the book doesn't definitively tell you. So I didn't clarify that either.
Yeah.
I left it in ambiguity because the focus more is about him saying, this is what's right for you. You need to do this procedure. And Magda in the book seems to be, she wants it. But in my adaptation of it, it sits in an ambiguous place. You're not quite sure he coerced her. She wants it. She doesn't want it. Nothing's quite certain. She's because it's more complex than that. She just doesn't know what decision to make. And so Mitchell agrees to do this abortion procedure because even though he's not trained in third trimester, he's done only early stage abortion. He agrees to do it because he knows that it'll get him in higher ranks in the hospital. And Opara wants him to do it, even though he may not be a specialist in that, because he's a very enterprising young doctor and he's less well known. Someone more well known, there might be gossip about Leon, about his daughter, and he didn't want any of that. He thought it's easier with a guy who he can put under his thumb and say, you keep your mouth shut and maybe you'll go places. So Mitchell agrees to Opara's conditions and does a legal procedure, does everything he should do as a doctor, but with the intention, like, this is a step forward in my career. And certainly, sure enough, it is. Opara takes him under his wing, suddenly opens doors for him to accelerate quite a bit up in the ranks in the hospital. And then you learn when Mitchell does go to abort the child, he messes it up and the kid is born breathing. Now, that wouldn't happen today, but the novel was written in the 90s. There were different procedures earlier on. Now they kind of euthanize the child before, not the child, they euthanize the fetus before they do the abortion. But now, in the past, they had other procedures which sometimes could lead to the child or the fetus being born and then dying as soon as it's born, or struggling, or they have to try to revive it. But the ethics around it right now is if there was a mess up, they're clear. If the fetus is born and then it's alive, you make sure it lives. That's where your resources
Life
go.
begins at birth, yeah.
That's right. But Mitchell, because he has his commitment with Opara and the commitment with Magda, when it comes out, it's his mistake because he didn't handle it properly. He feels responsible for the child. So this is where the story hits a fragmented point. In the story, as you hear it, he immediately rushes to save the child. The child lives, and as it grows up, you find out this kid is a brat. Leon Opara suddenly takes to his grandson, raises him as his own son. We never hear about Magda again. In the book you do, but even when you do, Magda doesn't talk at all about Leon. It's only the father Opara does. So the kid grows up, the kid's a brat, the kid is spoiled, he's violent, he's moody, he's aggressive. At one point, he does something, he hurts another kid, and the doctor's brought in quietly so they don't go to the hospital to make sure the kid is okay, but not report the incident, which again, what it amounts to is a series of breach of ethics on the doctor's part, which the audience is complicit in, because the audience watches in sympathetic association with the doctor and goes, well, yeah, what are you going to do? Like, this is what you have to do. You want to make a living. Like, what are you going to fight this guy who's going to ruin your career, or work with him and maybe he'll build a career? So the audience is complicit. The child grows up and is an absolute nightmare of a kid. But then at one point, Mitchell also has a daughter who's roughly the same age, Leon Opara's grandson, and the doctor's daughter. They end up dating, and then there's a fire. And I don't know how much to give away, but
yeah, you can't post spoiler. Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Leon Opara, the grandson, ends up, because he's in love with the daughter, on the phone with the mother when the fire breaks out, rushes over and saves the mother, saves the daughter. The doctor, meanwhile, comes home for a conference, sees the house is on fire, but his family is safe, and Leon helped. And so there's this thought of like, well, if the child had been aborted, he was such a, initially you think, was it a mistake? But how could it be a mistake? I don't know. You can't make that kind of moral decision. He is what he is. He's born. But then when the child saves his wife and daughter, you think, oh, so this is good karma. He did the thing, and then the kid ends up saving him, saving the family. But then what you find out is actually the grandson never existed. The mother and the daughter did die in the fire, and it was the doctor's fault, who set the fire by mistake before he left the house. So he caused the fire that killed his wife and daughter. There was no one to save them. And that led to his alcoholism, which led to the revoking of his medical license, which led to him ending up on the street and completely disenfranchised. And so when he realizes, he reconciles that the world that he thought of the child growing up and saving his wife and daughter is not true, and that he actually killed the kid, it's easy for an audience to go, oh, so that was karmic retribution. You killed the baby after it was born for your ambition, and as a consequence, you suffer now, so you kind of deserve to be homeless, or you deserve to be on the street. But the thing is, that's an audience making that value judgment. The narrative as it sits, there's no reason to believe that just whether he had saved the child or not, that child, which is of a different social status than his own, would grow up to date his daughter, and they would grow up, dating together, and then happen to be on the phone when the fire was set, happen to show up and happen to save his wife and daughter. It's kind of like any moment in your life where you're like, oh, I saw that cat walking across the street, and if I had just thrown a rock or yelled or done something, maybe I would have stopped getting hit by the car. And then something bad later happens in your life. Do you go, well, if I'd saved the cat, maybe this would have been fine? You can have that fantasy in your head, but there's no reason to think that those are connected.
Well, and I guess if I could push back maybe just gently against,
of course,
against the idea that this is the audience imposing this connection on there, because I would argue that it's Mitchell who imposes that connection. Because as you point out, it is completely improbable that had he saved the child, all of these things would have happened. And yet he's telling us the version, and maybe this is a lot more prominent in the person where he is telling us through his first person narration all of this, but he is presenting us with this seemingly improbable, but our narrator's telling us that this is what happened, so who are we to question it at this stage? He is the one who's linking these two completely unrelated events that have had clearly significant bearing on his life. As I put it, this is how I phrased it in the review, he is connecting his greatest regret, i.e. this mercy killing of this almost aborted but not quite fetus, and the loss of his family. So his greatest regret and the worst thing that ever happened to him. And in his mind, like in reality, because we do find out that these things have no causal relationship to each other, these things are completely separate, but it's in his mind, and the version of the story that he tells us treats it like a cosmic punishment, because if only I hadn't done my biggest regret, then the worst thing that ever happened to me wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't really see how it's the audience who is bringing that comparison, when it is very much the narrative logic of the story that is foisting that connection upon the audience in that way.
I would say the reason for that is because it's not out of the scope of possibility that all of us live with the what if scenario in our heads about a series of life decisions. What if I had chosen this instead of this, and something bad or something good could have happened? Because we live in that space, and Mitchell is living in the same space as us, and he has this imagining. You could think, okay, he's imposing, like I'm imposing that narrative that's then making the audience think that way. But I think I could probably find other things that the audience would be like, but that's not something that I ever experienced. I don't have those kinds of thoughts in my head. So I have a distance to go before I can find a sympathetic connection. If you've already got this idea of living with regret, or living with what if scenarios, or kind of the malleability of reality in the way that you imagine it versus the way it actually is, I think that's where the audience sits in complicity without being conscious that they're sitting in complicity. And I agree with you that it's kind of a dirty trick to tell the audience this and then to turn it around. I would say, if you look at a movie like The Usual Suspects, where Kaiser Soze, you find out at this is a big spoiler too.
Yeah, it's okay. Nobody's watching this movie anymore because of reasons, but yeah.
Right, I know, 100%. That character who's sitting there telling the police officer this whole elaborate story the whole time, and the officer's getting this information, then lets this guy go, and then discovers that guy was the master criminal when he sees all the stuff around his room that was a reference point for the story. So basically, this guy showed up, allowed himself to be kidnapped, used reference points to fabricate a narrative, and then leave and go away scot-free. That movie irritated me, because that movie I thought was a cheat. Other movies like that, really, there's bits about, like in movies where a character says something and then someone has snappy dialogue back. I go, well, okay, that's because you wrote it that way. You wrote it that you could get the snappy response. You probably had the snappy response before you had this stupid setup line. The actor playing the stupid setup line is like, yeah, but why would I say that? Well, because I need the snappy response.
Let me have my joke.
That's right. So in that construct, those are way more artificial. I think this one is less artificial. One of the things that's in this story that not everybody catches, but a few people did, is that right in the beginning of my adaptation and in the novel, it starts with Mitchell talking about he was beat up the other night, last night. Yeah. So he's concussed. You can watch the show and think, oh, he's unhoused. He's probably drunk. Even though there's 2 instances of Mitchell drinking. In the book, there's many. But in my adaptation, there's 2 instances of Mitchell drinking when he's offered booze. But the rest of the time, it's not that. He's concussed. And because he's concussed right in the beginning, he's been kicked in the head. He's in a delusional state the whole time until he comes to a point where he meets the nurse that he used to work with when he did abort that fetus. And she reminds him of what the reality is that helps him go, oh yeah, I buried that truth because I needed to create a different fiction for myself. Even that is psychologically something people can connect to. There are all sorts of memories that people bury for safety reasons, for, mental health reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And this has now surfaced and he's reconciled. But under no circumstances is the one thing directly connected to the other. The thing that's the commonality in between is his human experience, his suffering, his life. There's no karmic redemption.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what the story's about.
Well, and like I hear everything you're saying, and I agree in general. But this whole idea of the what ifs that we all live with, 100%, we can all relate to that in some level. I guess where I find tension in this is that it's one thing, though, what if I stop to look at that black cat and then I don't get hit by that car? It's another thing to be like, what if I didn't do this thing that's a very charged, gendered political issue, that if only I had done the thing that would have made the pro-life protesters that we do meet in the novel very happy, that I'm now going to break down into tears apologizing for, completely out of context, is a chapter that exists in the book that you did remove from your adaptation. But yeah, I struggle with of all the what ifs that could have been chosen to structure the story around. It still feels like the moral logic of the narrative is favoring a pro-life position.
I totally hear that. And there's a few people that did comment that back. So between the different shows that I did at Fringe and then when I did the ones at VideoCabaret, I made changes so that I really underscored Mitchell reflecting in the moment when he's holding the baby, instead of it being a moment where he looks at this baby that's breathing and then suffocates it. Instead of that happening like within a couple lines, he has a few more words where he looks at it and he says, I'm looking at my failure. I'm looking at my life's failure. I'm looking at everything I've tried to achieve, and have I just ruined it? Have I just screwed up the possibility of my future? What is anybody going to say? What's Apar going to say? What's Magda going to say? There's nobody else in the room.
Mm-hmm.
If I do this, can I save myself? And it's his ambition that does it. It's his ambition. So I tried to, and it's a point that I take strongly, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because I'm looking to hone that, because I don't want to tell that other story.
Yeah.
And I say, from a different perspective, if you told the story, it's also because of where we're sitting in the narrative. If you told the story as he saves this child and the child grows up to be a horrible dictator who commits mass murder, would he say, I should have never I shouldn't have tried to save it?
Mm-hmm.
It was my fault. They wanted to abort it. I screwed up, and then I saved it. I shouldn't have. And because I saved it, it ended up killing all these other people. Well, would you say, oh, well, that's an argument then? Yeah, he should.
Well, and the book does kind of propose that argument when does seem like he's growing up to be a tyrant, and he shoots that other kid in the leg. And I think there's a line that Lucy says to Mitch about how, are you so upset about this because you feel responsible for him existing? And, and I don't think anyone could reasonably feel that way. I can understand his inner guilt, or at least his questioning of, am I responsible for anything bad that this child does because I could have stopped it, the go back in time and shoot baby Hitler kind of argument. But it still to me just feels like, while yes, we agree because of how disconnected both all of these events are, the whatever life living Leon O'Para Jr. would go on to live, whether that be to, do some kind of genocide or to save Lucy and Cheryl Ann from the fire. It is still, and it's interesting because I'm grappling with the fact that as the incident is presented in the book and to the same extent in your adaptation, it is not an abortion. It was supposed to be, but the second that the child is born breathing, the act of, even if it's done out of career ambition or just the mercy killing of putting the child out of its misery, it becomes murder at that point. I would assume. I'm not a lawyer, but that...
My brother's a doctor, and he confirmed that the ethics of that are absolutely clear.
Okay.
You don't do that. So.
Okay, so I'm glad that kind of corroborates the way I'm thinking about it. So, and when I was explaining the plot of this to another friend of mine who didn't get to see the show, she said to me, well, so why are you going on about all the anti-abortion stuff about this? Because that's not an abortion, that's just a murder. I'm like, I know that intellectually, but the way that abortion is framed by the narrative, I would argue, wants us to view that act within an abortional framework. That
Right.
even though it is legally, technically, epistemologically not that thing, we still get the scene of the pro-life protest where he breaks down sobbing and apologizing, and we're meant to associate that with he's apologizing not just for killing Leon Alpara, but for killing all of the fetuses that he was responsible for. And I'm sure I could point to plenty other examples within the book itself, most of which are absent from your adaptation. But so I still struggle with the, of all the what ifs that this could have been, it still seems to me that it's a tricky one to have picked here, and I know this is less a comment for you than it is for Richard, who perhaps I would like to talk to as well, and maybe he has thoughts, because you also mentioned that he went on the record, and I'm glad to hear this, that he agrees with a woman's right to choose and all that stuff, and he wasn't trying to put forward this message, but I don't know if that excuses putting that message out into the world. And Mitch himself makes all of those same arguments prior to this, but then still ends the narrative with, at least in the novel, come to the light Cosette with, going into what seems like the pearly gates, and then Lucy's there, right. Cheryline is there, and baby Leon is also there. And I'm glad you got rid of that too, because I did not care for that as an ending personally, but...
100%. You know what? And the thing is that the things that you're pointing out, okay, so when I got into Fringe, as I say, I didn't get in thinking I would do Crosstown right away. I applied thinking I want to do a show at Fringe, but what show I don't know. Crosstown was one of a series of shows that I was going to do. And I had to weigh between all the different shows, which one was it that I wanted to tackle right now. I don't have to get into the other ones that I was looking at, but there were other pieces that I was going to create, which I still would like to create at a later stage. And the thing is that this one, exactly the thing that you're talking about, bothered me. And it bothered me so much that I was like, I don't know how to solve it. So what do I do? Do I walk away from it, or do I lean into it? I know that there's a risk. I really sincerely thought there was a risk that I would have like people scream at me, that they would shut down the show. They'd be upset with me. They'd say, what are you trying to say? I was worried I would feel like people would get mad at me, alienate me, if they think that's what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot of anxiety before I even chose to do it, which is also why it was an 11th hour edit. I really only edited the script and got it done, I'd say maybe 2 weeks, a week and a half before we opened. Okay. Up to that point, I kept looking at the edit and I really didn't touch it. Mm-hmm. I had months to do it, and I didn't because I needed to figure out, what am I actually trying to say? What is the actual thesis line? And once I settled on, like, it's about ambition, and this becomes a metaphor within the construct of that. Is it strong enough? Can I tether it enough? Given how charged all the other stuff, is it worth doing, or is this the wrong narrative to even approach? And it's still on my head, to the point that I know it was well received. It's gotten a lot of really good response. I probably could take it, and somebody might be willing and interested to produce it. But there's a part of me that's still like, is the central audience, the people most directly affected by this, receiving it in a way different than the way that I intend? Because if they are, that's all that's important to me, and it's a reason for me not to do the show and just retire it, doing it at Fringe, and it's over. I never do it again, possibly. And that is still on my head. The people that I've spoken with, there's a couple friends of mine who know people who work with teenagers who are pregnant and deal with crisis counseling, and what their options are and how to go through it. And when they saw the show, I asked them, like, so what was your response? And what they said was, they didn't make any qualitative response about whether it is or isn't supporting any platform. What they said was, they saw a simple but accurate representation in the representation. They saw their clients. They saw the people that they were working for and helping represented. But they were it wasn't any easier to deal with the show and watching that than it was in the real world. It's still empathy, listening, trying to be supportive, trying to do whatever you can. But it's a challenge that person's going through, and there's really not much more you can do. And so it really reinforced for me that thing in art, which is, I think a lot of artists I know, especially with everything going on in the world, struggle with, I want to make art that changes the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think they have to have an answer to the problems, because if you say things are a problem, you get somebody to go, well, you're well and good to sit there complain about the problem. What's the solution? You don't have a solution. What are you talking about? Shut your mouth, sit down. But the job of the artist is not to solve the problem. It's the principal thing. You know, to hold the mirror up as if to nature, right? You just have to say, I'm going to take a second to make you see the world, and hopefully a little bit differently when you leave than when you came in. Take a second to think. Everybody has a narrative going on in their life. Take a second to think that there are big decisions that you have no direct investment in, but you feel you have an opinion that's valid to force upon the world or force upon your family or friends without thinking about the implications on those who it affects the most. Like, it's more reflecting the audience's own sensibilities than it is telling them definitively one thing or another. There's no intention with this show. If this show ever got hijacked by I'm not going to call it pro-life. I don't think it's pro-life. I think it's
I use that term out of convenience. I also agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. If it ever got co-opted that way, there's no limit on how far I would go to absolutely repeat that. I'd say that's not fundamentally at all what this is. And if I can't solve the problem of not leaving with that kind of ambiguity, then I won't do the show anymore. If I can solve it so people at least understand, even if they're left in kind of a state of confusion or state of having to make a decision of their own. Because this is the interesting thing. People don't say, this makes me think, oh, I was supporting choice and supporting abortion. Now I saw the show. Now I'm thinking, well, maybe I don't. That's not really the response that I'm getting. No. The response I'm getting is people coming and saying, I thought we were friends. Like, are we friends? Like, are you really holding that opinion? That's the response. It's the polarizing of whose side are you on? Are you on my side? I thought you were on my side. And now it feels like you're not on my side. But the people, you know what I mean? The show, I don't think is changing anybody's mind one way or the other. It's causing people to feel that I'm creating a definitive statement in one direction or another that makes them feel alien to me. Mm-hmm. And that's not great. But it's not the same as changing somebody's opinion about it.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because a single work of art so seldom changes anybody's opinion about anything. Maybe they'll stick in your mind, and over a lifetime of different encounters and choices, your opinion will change, possibly informed by that work of art, but never because of it, or very rarely. But I think what you're attesting to here is less that there's a concern that someone will be very pro-choice, see this show, and then my entire worldview is shattered, because what if all of the aborted fetuses could have ended genocide or war or to save people from a fire? Or like it's a preposterous thing to assume that anyone's going to take away from it. But, and I think what you're attesting to here is, this I think speaks to Toronto theater in general, but you have cultivated a very left-leaning audience, one that is predisposed to come in with a pro-choice position. And then when they encounter this, they feel like, I think, it's so rare in Toronto theater to see something that is espousing what looks like the alternative perspective on this. Right. And that's where that feeling of potential betrayal maybe comes from, that you have noted some people come to you with after. I think the dangerous flip side of that to me is that you say that if any, anti-abortion people were to herald this show as productive to their agenda, you would emphatically deny that. But I feel like it exists as a work of art that could easily be co-opted in that way, because it doesn't say anything to dispute that worldview. And if it says anything at all, as ambiguous as it tries to be, it does lean more towards that ideological orientation. And that's, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm harping on this a lot, but it's unfortunately, it is the heavy asterisk that hangs over a piece that I loved so much. And I love art that does make me question and grapple with these things, but it also made me occasionally reluctant to suggest it to certain people, which is unfortunate for a piece that I would really very much love to recommend to anybody, because I thought it was so strong in every other regard.
Well, listen, there's a few things. First of all, similarly, like if you saw it and you were like, if it was this but not this, I would be like, okay, now I get it. Now it's clear. But because it's so tethered to the narrative, You can't really kind of split the two. The story is the story, and so either it has to happen or not happen. It has to be buried and never happen again, or evolve in its own way. And more interestingly for me is the talkback, the discussion around the story to clarify the point of view or listen to people's feedback on the story. I think that's really essential. But another thing too that you talked about is curating a left-leaning audience. No matter who's in front of me in a performance, there is very little validity for me in preaching to the converted, as they say. Like, if your job when you come to a show, whether it's a comedy show or any stand-up show or theater, music, dance, whatever, is to see heightened reality, is to see something in a perspective that makes you change the way you live in the world a little bit. And the objective with this show is to make you think about ambition. Republican and conservative politicians who, on the one hand, probably are not hard, some, not all, some are not super hardcore in support of all of this backlash against Roe v. Wade, but they go along with it because they go, the greater good is we're going to get the economic or other reform that we want. So, okay, that's the ticket. We will agree to the minor conservative few in order to get the ticket. And so they compromise their own principles out of ambition. They act hypocritically out of ambition. That's a real world thing. And that's also being examined in this play. If the guy was a conservative, if Mitchell was a conservative politician, not politician, he was a conservative voting doctor. And it would be a different story than otherwise. The audience needs to be provoked at all times, no matter what the show is. Comedy provokes by putting a surprise in the brain, surprise, juxtaposition of ideas or words. If there's no surprise, then you're not laughing. It's not a comedy. You need surprise, you need innovation, you need something a little bit heightened and different. You need to be provoked in some way, otherwise what are we doing? I don't know what. Like, there's a lot of beautiful things to go and look at in the world. You don't need to go and sit in a room and listen to somebody tell you everything you already know. You know, all the protests that are happening right now for a variety of things, the challenge is it's making people, it's like land acknowledgements. When I've spoken with Indigenous friends of mine who are like, I think the way that people are doing it, the audience is receiving it like, oh, okay, you have to do this. Go ahead, tell me. You know, I don't know if I'm supposed to feel bad about things. I don't, or I do. But what am I going to do? I came to see a show. Now you're going to tell me, okay, go ahead, say the land acknowledgement. I find that offensive. I find it offensive as a response, but also offensive in the way that it allows an audience to curating that response. If you're not speaking to the audience in a lived experience in a real world way, here and now, present with people, with morals in front of you, and provoking them a little bit to think a little bit deeper about things, then I don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, that's and I would agree with all of that in terms, like, and certainly conceptually, like, yes, preaching to the choir isn't productive artistically, let alone politically. I guess where, again, sorry that I keep sort of circling back to this.
It's okay, yeah.
Because you have done such a great job of provoking thought with this show. But I think of, maybe in terms of what you're describing, I think of a film like Get Out, for example. You've seen the Jordan Peele horror film Get Out, where that, I think, provokes the audience in a way that certainly doesn't preach to the choir, because it's expecting its predominantly white liberal audience, I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could, to become uncomfortable when pointed out to them that you are also a racist. How could I be? And that, I think, is an excellent job of preaching to the choir that, like, the real horror of racism isn't necessarily the Confederate flag toting folks that you might picture when you imagine a racist in your head, but it is the more insidious racism that exists beneath the surface. That, yes, certainly does not preach to the choir in that way. Probably why it didn't win Best Picture at the Oscars, because I think a lot of the Academy voting base probably felt uncomfortably called out by it.
Right.
Where what I worry with something like Crosstown is that it certainly doesn't preach to the choir. It invites this alternative perspective, but the alternative perspective in some ways is a regressive one. It is not breaking people out of the complacency in their left-leaning politics. It is inviting them to consider, however unintentionally, a fundamentally right-wing perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair and valid criticism. And I think, again, like I say, then it comes down to ideas and how dangerous are ideas. Are there certain things that we should not say, we should not do? Is there a way to talk about this that reframes the idea? Should I, as a man, even be speaking about this? That was another big consideration. Is this my story to tell at all? Well, I mean, there's men who are making the legal decisions. There's men that pass the law. There's men that are running the clinics, and there's men that are arresting people running the clinics. So I'm implicated. Either I say something or I don't say something. If the thing that I say, what could I say to be most supportive? Maybe this is not the story to be saying it. Maybe I don't need to say it. I am still struggling with it, in all sincerity. I still grapple with it. As I consider whether I'll develop it further or not, it's the constant question of, can I open up sections of it to iterate more, to not have people think that I'm trying to push them into a right-wing consideration. But I think part of the reason people also feel betrayed by the story is that someone, actually a friend of mine, said, you made me really like Mitchell until that moment. And then I was mad at you because you made me feel sympathetically connected to him, and then suddenly completely revolted by him and so angry with him. And I was like, okay, so then you had no trouble that he was like making all of these other decisions all the way along that were compromising principles? That was okay? And they're like, well, you made it charming. And I'm like, right, but I think there was an early stage where you could have gone, oh, I don't know about this guy. It seems like he's on shaky foot. He's a bit, but this is because whenever you put somebody in the center of a narrative, your natural response as an audience is to be sympathetic to the central narrative. You do a story about the worst human beings in the world, unless you're showing them as grotesque creatures the whole time, you're going to get a complex response because you have to show them with the moments of being human, people they love, people that love them, people that they take care of, people that care about them, people whose lives they help, and vice versa. And then the audience goes, wait a minute, don't make me see them as a human being. It's a monster. Why are you making me like this person? You can't. Don't do that. Don't let me live in a way that I only see them in one way. And you can do that. But what's the value of it? Does that really help anybody? Does that make you go, okay, so what we need to do is paint, and what's the state we're in right now? Somebody could have a whole career where they do all sorts of things that you love them and you love them. And then they do something bad. No question that it's bad. Then suddenly you feel betrayed because they made you like them for so long. But
I loved all those wizard books you wrote for all those years. What are you doing?
Exactly. The thing is, he brings the same question, art or the artist. Can you love the art without loving the artist? Or is it impossible? Well, okay, so let's say, this is going to go off on a tangent, but I'm going to say, okay, absolutely no problem. I say, if you don't love the artist, the art can be as beautiful as you want it to be. It's still poison. It's not good. It shouldn't be supported, accepted, whatever. Okay, so art has that place in the world. But what about crops? You know, there was a guy who was really significant in a chemical that he developed that allowed global farming to really grow, fertilizer, a way of treating fertilizer to allow global farming to happen that, you know, ended up solving hunger in a lot of places. And that same guy is the one who develops Zyklon B, which famously, you know, was used in the chambers in Auschwitz. So what do you do? Like, my farming and the fact that I can get fresh fruits,
cancel agriculture.
You know what I'm saying? This is the problem, is we're in a time where we're building a kind of binary. As we argue that there should be no binaries, we're putting binaries in place for anybody who doesn't believe that there should be no binaries. That's not what I meant to phrase, but you know what I'm trying to say?
I get what you're saying, yeah.
We're going into more nuanced conversation, and as a result, people are like worried because they're worried, like, who's my neighbor? Who's this person that I've known, I've been with for so long? Are they actually somebody else than the whole time I thought they were? And so you don't know because you want to do the right thing, you want to do the good thing, you want to support the good people. Suddenly somebody says or does something. Now, if I did something, that's one thing. If I'm saying something and you're not sure of what I'm saying, it's still problematic. But it's not we're having a discussion about it, but not everybody wants to have a discussion about it. There's people who are like, let's close the door. I think this has made me wary about having a conversation. I just don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's close the door. I'm done with this artist. Okay, if that's true, then I'm sorry. Okay, then what do you want me to do so you like me? I'll do the things you like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm not abdicating responsibility for it. What I'm trying to say is all of these ideas are in my head. I'm aware that I'm walking a tightrope. I'm aware that it's a dangerous line. I'm aware that I could do a comedy show or I could do a mime show or something light or fun or, dramatize Edgar Allan Poe or somebody. Like, I'm aware I could do something that's an audience favorite. I'm leaning into a thing that I don't know about that I know is dangerous for me to do in a whatever way. And I have to reconcile, is that a danger for me or danger for others? If it's a danger for others, I shouldn't do it. If it's a danger for me, let's find what does this conversation lead to? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And like, for the record, even if it seems like I'm grilling you at points of this conversation, like I appreciate you like taking on these challenges. I appreciate you wanting to have this discussion about it on an open forum when we could have just had this in a bar and nobody had to be privy to it. I appreciate, I appreciate how deeply you are thinking about this and that it wasn't wasn't a politically motivated decision to present the material in this way, but also that I would have been more concerned if it was an apathetic, haphazard decision that you didn't consider all of these implications of. That I'm happy that you have been, so open to discussing this. And I don't know what the answers are either, but I was felt challenged by this work, both the novel and your performance of it. And I don't know if I've received more clarity on any of it, but I do appreciate the cluster of nuances that this conversation has allowed me to continue using as I continue thinking about it.
And I really appreciate you provoking as much as you have, even in the gentlest of ways, because it's the rigor of the conversation that helps me and helps the art in general.
Yeah.
The rigor is really important. I don't know that maybe if I was an audience member coming to see the show, if I wouldn't have as strong or stronger views than you or other people have expressed in about the show. Should it be done or shouldn't be done? What is this? Who's speaking? Why are you speaking? Why now? Why this? I would probably have the same response. When I'm in it, it's a different situation than when I'm outside of it with distance from it to be able to be critical. Yeah. But I also don't know that I would see something and say unequivocally, don't do that. I don't know if I would. Maybe I would. I'm not suggesting that you're saying that at all. You've been so supportive. But it is, I appreciate the rigor. I appreciate and I invite it from anyone listening who saw the show. I really do invite the conversation. I invite the provocation. And it doesn't make me feel bad. It makes me feel good, because the worst thing is for people to have those thoughts and not say them. And then we have this elephant in the room, as you said.
Walt Disney surrounded himself with yes men, but who wasn't a yes man? His brother Roy.
That's right.
Yes. And I appreciate it. Yes. Okay, I think we could probably close a chapter. We could remove the leopard spoiler from the screen, but thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really do appreciate your care and your nuance and willingness to unpack all of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would love to, as I edit the script, if you're interested in reading it, I'll send it and see what you think. Of course.
I am a dramaturg. Yes. So I'm very happy to look at anything you want to send me, and we can continue talking about this. Perhaps not on an open forum next time, and we can, really dig into any more of the weeds if there are any left. So yes, before we bid adieu. So right now, the future of Crosstown is uncertain if it will have another instantiation or an afterlife. But what's next for you? Because as an artist, this isn't the only thing you do. Do you know what some of your future projects are, and are you able to announce any of them at this stage?
There's one I think I'm allowed to announce that in January. I think we start rehearsals in January, so probably going up in February. I'll be at the Belfry Theatre in Victoria doing Behind the Moon. which is by Anush
Yes,
Shivani.
right. Yes, of course.
That's one that I can speak of. There's other things that are kind of maybe happening, maybe not happening. And there's also stuff that I'm writing and working on. I'm at a point in my life as an artist where I'm just like really trying to figure out when do I want to put my energies most. And I think what I'm looking to do is just a lot more writing, a lot more creating, play more music. There's stand-up that I've done a few times that I want to lean into more. It's more for me, less about a career and the ambition of that, and more just about other ways of expressing. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Check my Insta.
Yeah, of course, everyone. Well, so let's plug your Insta now. If people want to find and follow you and continue these conversations, perhaps elsewhere, where can they find you? What's your handle?
All social media, it's HRH Anand Rajaram.
Yes, perfect.
I'm on TikTok. I'm on Twitter. I don't really use LinkedIn, but I'm on there. I'm on Facebook. What else is there? I'm on Snapchat. I don't what else. Whatever.
Same handle everywhere.
Same handle. Threads. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Your Royal Highness. And this has been such an enriching conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time in your day for all of this. People should check out all of your future projects, and hopefully they can see Crosstown at some point in the future, and we'll see what it evolves into and what the versions of these conversations we have thereafter might look like. If people want to check us out, Cup of Hemlock Theatre, we are at COH Theatre on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like, share, subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this. You've been on the internet before. You know how this works. Okay, Anand, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I don't know if you heard, there was a big thunderclap there as I'm trying to do the sign off. Take care, everyone. Stay healthy. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.
Thanks so much. Cheers.